Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Alex Puritz. I'm with the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, and I'm joined by Julia Wolf and Jennifer Dubkowski. And today we are going to be presenting on climate vulnerability, focused on Alaska climate adaptation as part of our joint webinar series between the Ocean Acidification Program, Sea Grant, and the Climate Program Office. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Jen, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Alex. My name is Jen Dubkowski, and I'm the Program Manager for the Climate and Fisheries Adaptation Program, also known as CAFA. We are a partnership program with National Marine Fisheries Service Office of Science and Technology, and our program is a research program that seeks to advance the understanding of climate variability and change on fisheries systems and fishing communities in response to rapidly changing climate and ocean conditions. And we do this through interdisciplinary research that advances adaptation and provides actionable insights for resource managers, for fishing communities, and for stakeholders. Next slide, please. And some of our research teams are, actually all of our research teams are part of a national community of practice that supports the exchange of knowledge and information to advance their research. And this includes supporting different types of research that they're doing, including fisheries, biology, and climate modeling work to support regional pilot projects that are in support of the Climate Ecosystems and Fisheries Initiative. As well as engaging with communications and engagement work with resource managers and communities as well. And our program and projects support 3-year research proposals. And today you're going to hear a little bit more about 2 of our projects that are focused on the Alaska region. So I think I'm going to hand it over to Julia at this time to share more about Sea Grant.
Thanks. My name is Julia Wolf. I'm the competition manager at the National Sea Grant Office, which is a NOAA office. Sea Grant's mission is to enhance the practical use and conservation of coastal, marine, and Great Lakes resources to create a sustainable economy and environment. We were founded in 1966 under the National Sea Grant College and Program Act. Our network consists of 34 university-based programs, which you can see here. An advisory board, and the National Sea Grant Office of NOAA in Silver Spring. Next slide. A quick slide. Our approach is based on a 3-prong: research, extension, and education. Our research is to expand knowledge to understand where there are gaps and answer those. Our extension is to connect the science that we do or that we can find with those who can use it. And our education is to train coastal and marine workforce. Next slide. So Sea Grant provides relevant and timely information with research based on the urgent needs of coastal managers and residents, and our focus is on place-based science. We get our information out to users using our outreach and extension networks to put research results to good use. And we have 4 strategic focus areas you can see here: healthy coastal ecosystems, resilient communities and economies, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, and environmental literacy and workforce development. That's it.
Thank you. And lastly, at the Ocean Acidification Program, our mission is to better prepare society to respond to changing ocean conditions and resources by expanding our understanding of ocean acidification through interdisciplinary partnerships, both nationally and internationally. We do this through a transdisciplinary approach. We call this the trifecta approach. It looks at biological sensitivity, environmental change, and human dimensions. And really at the heart of this is vulnerability. How are people and the ecosystems they depend on vulnerable to ocean acidification, and how can we increase resiliency and adaptation strategies in the face of this? So this is really the heart of where our regional vulnerability and resiliency assessments come in, and you'll hear today from one of our funded PIs on his project. So the goal of the RVAs are to synthesize ocean acidification information at a regional scale to assess where societal vulnerabilities exist or are emerging in order to provide actionable information for marine resource decision makers. So with that, we're gonna jump into hearing from our projects. And so first up, we will be hearing from Tom Hurst from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Give me 1 second to get him set up. Hi, Tom. All right, and so as Tom's getting set up, today Tom will be presenting on his project called Evaluating Ocean Acidification Vulnerability and Interactions Among Traditional and Emerging Coastal Alaska Industries. So Tom, feel free to take it away.
Great, Alex. I just want to confirm you can see my screen here.
We see your emails.
You see my, okay, well, we don't want that. Hang on. Oh. All right, screen.
Yes, we see your screens now, your slides now.
And you're in full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Great, thanks everybody for having me. Welcome to the webinar. I'm gonna spend a few minutes reporting on a project that we have going, looking at climate resilience in communities in the Gulf of Alaska, and using community models to understand adaptive capacity and climate change. This is a collaborative work involving a number of biologists, ecosystem scientists, and socioeconomics, sociologists and economics researchers from NOAA and other partner institutes. And excuse me, just a little bit of background. People probably recognize this already, but ocean warming and acidification is happening faster in the Gulf of Alaska and other Alaskan waters than many other places around the country and around the world. And coastal Alaskans depend on the marine environment and have more at stake from the marine environmental shifts of climate change, with 1 in 7 Alaskans with jobs in the seafood industry and 1 in 10 Alaskans with jobs in tourism, which is tremendously driven by the environmental interests in Alaska. And there are at least 8 distinct indigenous groups that rely upon marine resources for subsistence and cultural continuity. So in summary, again, I think probably the audience mostly knows this, but coastal Alaskans are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and are both sensitive to the shifts in their environment. And because of that, they are invested in adaptation to prevent further damage to their way of life. So the project I'm going to talk about took place in 4 heavily marine dependent communities in the Gulf of Alaska. Those are Kodiak, Homer, Hoonah, and Sitka. And we selected those communities to try to provide a good overview of different kinds of communities that have different kinds of industries and social structures, to get a broader view of both the sensitivity of the communities and potential adaptation strategies for those. And in those communities, we did a series of participatory workshops. And basically, this is the model of what we were trying to accomplish. And in a way, sort of, working from left to right, we want to look at how the community is experiencing climate change and how that climate change is impacting the bioecological system upon which the members of those communities rely upon for various aspects of their community and individual well-being, and then try to link those more specifically to what those aspects of the socioeconomic system are. So who is using what resources, how exactly well-being in the community is tied to those resources, and what the governance of those resources are, so that we can look for opportunities and limitations to adaptation. So I'll go through a little bit about the workshops, but not a tremendous amount in detail. A workshop was held in each community. Stakeholders, a wide range of stakeholders were invited to participate in those. It was a 3-hour workshop with participants in the workshops ranging from 8 to 30 based on the size of the community. And not surprisingly, the largest workshop was in Kodiak and the smallest workshop was in Hoonah, consistent with the sizes of those communities. I will point out there were 2 workshops held in Kodiak. One sort of focused at Kodiak, what we call the town of Kodiak, and a second workshop specifically with the Kodiak Area Natives Association to gain perspectives from the communities surrounding the Kodiak archipelago that are represented by CANA. And just really quickly, the workshop had a couple of main components. The first was allowing people to provide individual responses to a series of questions that are sort of outlined there. And then that was followed up with small group discussions that we focused on environmental change, climate vulnerability, and adaptation. Those were then coded, and the results of those were coded and come up with graphics to illustrate what happened. Anyway, so again, the goal of the project is to visualize the relationships in a way that helps the communities plan and understand the threats to various aspects of community well-being. And so those resulted in a series of connective community models, which are shown in the next 5 slides. And just to orient you a little bit, the sizes of the nodes in each of those things is represented by how much interest and discussion there was on each of the topics. So, and the arrows that you'll see depict the relationships between those. So I'll introduce this with one of them. The first one is Kodiak, and the next few slides will have the same layout. So this figure shows various aspects that we talked about. So starting in the upper middle, the climate stressors, and again, the size of the circle in the middle with the words shows how important that issue was in the conversation. And again, so sort of going across these, the colors will be maintained in the different network models, so you'll be able to track them through. But things were broken up into, the discussion was broken up into the climate stressors that people were interested in, which aspects of the bioecological system that they were most focused on or most sensitive to changes in, so aspects of the socioeconomic system, adaptation actions here in blue that could be taken, what some barriers to adapting in their community might be in sort of a brown color, and then various mechanisms toward adaptation in the purple there. So some of the things I'll just point out that came across, and I'll flip through these quickly, but using Kodiak as a model, what we'll see very often is in the climate stressors, warmer conditions came across as a predominant factor of concern in all the communities. And then depending on the nature of the conversation, there was a number of other aspects of climate stressors. And again, these are pretty broad, and sometimes we'll have to get into a little bit more detail to talk about the linkages of what some of these things might mean. But anyway, those are the things that people were generally focused on as climate stressors. In the bioecological system, the thing that came out the most in all communities was salmon. There's, of course, an overriding interest and concern about the future of salmon across all these communities. Let's see, in terms of adaptation actions, these were pretty variable across communities to some degree, although there was a lot of interest in just understanding and modifying management structures for fisheries and other types of harvests. And then there's barriers to adaptation, which centered around a lot of similar ideas, but might have had different mechanisms of expression in the different communities. So, so just to compare that with, this is the other workshop that was held in Kodiak, focus in conjunction with the Kodiak Area Native Association. And again, we see salmon jumping out, and it's not surprising that subsistence was the overwhelming concern in terms of a socioeconomic dimension, the dimension of well-being. And in the climate stressors, we see a few things. Again, warmer conditions comes up, but other things that sort of are not directly, but sort of indirectly related to climate is the expanded user groups, and that sort of reflects the climate and the overall climate and how the people are experiencing changes in the resources in their community. This is the model for Homer. Again, ocean conditions, warmer ocean conditions is a prominent concern. Ocean acidification comes up here along with harmful algal blooms is very much of interest. Again, salmon, and in terms of the well-being dimensions, again, a little bit different phrasing, but food security. But in Homer, they also spent a lot of time focused on their linkage to the marine community as providing a really important sense of place. And again, that shows up in all communities, but was a little bit more prominent in our discussions in Homer. Sitka model, again, subsistence is important. Salmon is important. In Sitka, I think herring actually turned out to be of largest concern among the people in the meeting, but that was probably in part due to the timing that we were there right before the annual herring harvest, and herring was front and center on people's minds when we happened to be there to have these discussions. And finally, Huna, a lot of the same things showing up in the same ways. So I know that was pretty rushed, but I'll give you a couple of highlights that sort of came through in each of the communities. First is that ocean warming was the most common threat voiced by participants, although there's a lot of aspects of warming that might be affecting communities differently, and how people are perceiving what the specific threat related to ocean warming might be. As I mentioned, salmon was the most important resource raised in these discussions in every community except Sitka, but again, that probably has to do with the timing of our meeting that we held in Sitka. Subsistence, food security, and overall ecosystem health tended to be the largest aspects of community well-being that people believed were going to be threatened by changes in the climate and the ecosystems. And responsive fisheries management and local food production were areas that most participants saw opportunities for adaptation. And then last, climate uncertainty, expanded user groups, access to information, and increased costs were considered to be the largest barriers to adaptation. And again, exactly how those played out was a little bit different in communities. So some of the limitations from this kind of discussion, this kind of approach, is that there's not a really good sense of scale. As you probably know, individual choices can be very different than the choices and policies at the community level or state and federal level, but they're sort of reflected the same in these models based on how they were constructed. As I mentioned, there was a lot of similarities in the discussion across communities. There were differences, but I think this level of analysis didn't really allow us to dive into exactly how some of those differences might be expressed, or how different communities might really focus on the needs for adaptation and what their specific barriers might be in response to different objectives. And they show a broad nature of the community responses, but there's a lot of different opinions that will come across in different people's interests. So just to wrap up, some next steps for this project is sharing back these model results with communities and in other venues like this one and other similar venues. Multiple communities are developing climate adaptation plans, and so we hope to provide this information and share the details of what's behind it with them for use in those plans to the extent that they can take advantage of this effort. There's a separate part of this project which I didn't talk about, which is looking at economic impacts and focusing on the costs associated with changes to subsistence use. And just some broader next steps would be to employ connective models in these community level resilience initiatives and planning efforts. We're discussing whether these kinds of work should be expanded to other communities, and then do some follow-up work to refine some of the community vulnerabilities that were identified in this first round of this effort. And so I just want to say thank you to the communities that participated in these workshops, and to the funding support from the Ocean Acidification Program Office, and to all my colleagues. And if there's time, I'll take a question, but I'll leave that up to Alex to ask questions now, or we can go on, ask questions later on in the discussion period at the end of the webinar. So I'll stop showing my slides now and turn things back over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Tom. If you want to stay on for just a second, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or in the question box. I don't see anything yet, but I guess I do have a question for you. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how you established the initial connections and relationships in the communities where you held the workshops.
That was, yeah, so identifying the people that participated in the workshops was done through a couple of different ways, through word of mouth and discussing with people that would be of interest, that would have interest in participating in this kind of effort with some local community leaders. So we identified a list of people to specifically invite, and then a second layer asked them to identify people that they also knew that might be interested, and we wanted to get a broad range of participation that represented a range of industries and user groups and interests. And then the meetings also were publicly announced and open to the public, so there was an opportunity for even people we didn't specifically target to learn about the meetings and self-select in terms of the desire to participate.
Thank you. Looks like we did get one other question. How can we see more information on some of the components in Tom's talk? Looks like a lot of fantastic information. Wondering if groups identified the types of tools and information they would like to help with adaptation.
Yeah, so this stuff will be coming out. One of our goals is to make sure that we're sharing it with the communities identically. So first, and so we've begun that process, but we want to make sure that the communities that participated have a chance to see and take advantage of the information, and also work with us to figure out how we can tweak it and what specifically we can provide from the more detailed information that's not captured in these summaries to help them in their planning processes. So there will be opportunities to see more of this. Again, first focused on the communities and the participants, but then this will be more publicly available sort of as we work through it.
Great, thank you. And just a clarifying question from someone in the audience, is this, is the workshop that you mentioned the same or similar as the one that's happening in Cordova, Alaska on Monday, November 18th, do you know?
That's not related to this project. Maybe that might be related to Marisha's project, or I'm not sure. As you'll see today, there's a number of projects that have somewhat similar goals, focusing on slightly different aspects of the economics and communities and things. So maybe Marisha, when she comes on, she might be able to answer that question.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're gonna head over to our next speaker, but we'll have some more time for Q&A at the end. So thank you again, Tom. Really awesome to see those community models as well. All right, so with that, we are going to move on to our next speaker. So Julia will be presenting him.
I'll be introducing.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So this is Jake Cohen. I'm excited to introduce an Alaska State Sea Grant Fellow working with the Kodiak Area Native Association to support tribal ocean acidification monitoring programs on Kodiak Island. During his fellowship, Jake has traveled around the state to speak with researchers and learn from the successes of peer communities. And before his fellowship, Jake received a master's degree in oceanography from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, conducting research in the northern Gulf of Alaska focused on community structure of marine microbes. So take it away, Jake. You are still muted.
Awesome, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And can you see my screen?
Yep,
Yes,
looks good.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Jake Cohen. I'm an Alaska Sea Grant Fellow, and for the past year, I've been working with Dave and Holen, who's based up in Anchorage, on both climate adaptation and ocean acidification monitoring in coastal Alaska. So Tom talked a little bit about the Kodiak Area Native Association. For the past year, I've partnered with them, as well as 4 of the tribes here on Kodiak Island on monitoring for ocean acidification. And for those of you who aren't aware, Kodiak Island is in Alaska, and it's located about 250 miles southwest of Anchorage. You can kind of see it in this box here. It's a traditional homeland of the Alutiiq-Sugiyaq people who live in a number of remote villages around the island. And it's also home to the hub community of Kodiak, which has a population of about 5,000 that's heavily involved in the commercial fishing industry. It's also home to the largest Coast Guard base in the country. And between all the different diverse people on the island, everybody is relatively connected due to their kind of livelihoods that are based on the sea. And of course, like everybody who's working in a marine region, people in Kodiak are heavily being impacted by a changing climate. So warming oceans are having a lot of impacts on coastal communities and economies, including Kodiak, which is seeing shifts in fisheries stock, as well as coastal erosion. But one emerging long-term stressor, of course, is ocean acidification. And ocean acidification monitoring has been occurring around Kodiak for about 10 years by NOAA, by the University of Alaska. But most of this has been kind of either offshore or kind of located in the hub community. And for about 5 years now, some of the tribes in Kodiak have been concerned about ocean acidification in their waters. In 2019, ocean acidification was identified by tribes as a priority, and funding was gained through the EPA's Indian General Assistance Program to establish a monitoring program in Kodiak and some of the communities around the island to monitor ocean acidification. So Kodiak's ocean acidification monitoring program has been occurring in the 4 tribal communities of Yuzinki, Port Lions, Larsen Bay, and Old Harbor, as well as the hub community of Kodiak since 2019. And this is operated by the tribes, the Kodiak Area Native Association, as well as our partners at the Chugach Regional Resource Association. So every 2 weeks, our tribal samplers in each village will go out, collect a sample of seawater, which is then fixed with mercuric chloride to kind of stop metabolic processes. And this sample is then sent to Seward and the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute's lab for analysis, which is then, after several months, kind of given back to the tribes to provide data on seawater conditions in a lot of these kind of like coastal waterways. And this is really important because if you look at the kind of geology of Kodiak Island, there's a lot of bays and inlets where a lot of communities are conducting these subsistence harvests and collecting their ocean acidification samples. And a lot of these have a different oceanography than some of kind of the offshore waters and even some of the more open waters that you'll see kind of off Kodiak, the city over here. So this provides some of the geographically widest data on ocean acidification around Kodiak and provides conditions on areas that are really important to tribes for subsistence harvest and kind of cultural practices. And I can show you some of the data here. This is a 5-year time series of pH collected in some of the Kodiak communities. So you can see here on the y-axis, of course, we have pH. You can see the 5-year time period between 2019 and 2023, partway through 2023 here. And you'll notice that you see a typical kind of pattern with pH where you have a higher pH in the summer months and a lower pH in the winter months. And that's just due to kind of ongoing uptake of carbon dioxide by phytoplankton and kelp in some of the spring and summer months, and then kind of a die-off and higher respiration in the winter. But you can see that you see a pretty general seasonal curve, and that matches up with some of the mooring data that we've also collected in Kodiak. So between 2014 and 2016, a mooring in Kodiak Harbor collected data on pH, and you can see that kind of just the seasonal slope and the range of pH that we see here kind of mirrors the trend kind of seen with some of the modeling. So that's really important because it kind of shows some of the accuracy of the data collected by the tribes and ensures that kind of the efforts are going towards useful data. We also calculate aragonite saturation levels with tribal pH, some of the tribal data, and you can see that this provides like a lot of useful data for tribes who are concerned about impact on subsistence resources. So of course, when aragonite saturation levels are above 2, they're healthy, and both kind of calcifying zooplankton and important shellfish can calcify. Between 1 and 2, they can be stressed, and below 1, it can be harmful to larval organisms and even sometimes to adult shellfish. So you can see that for most of the year, a lot of the conditions around Kodiak can be stressful, with some kind of really healthy conditions occurring in the summer and fall, and that sometimes in the winter months, we are dipping down into relatively kind of stressful conditions for a lot of organisms. And I also want to point out, kind of before going further, that this data was all collected by our tribal samplers. The data is owned by the tribes. And I, again, I'm a Sea Grant Fellow working with CANA, so I have these connections and have permission to kind of share at talks like this. But at the end of the day, the data is collected for tribal use and is used for climate adaptation and community planning by our subsistence harvesters. And each year, the Kodiak Area Native Association hosts a water quality workshop for interested tribal samplers and partners. And I presented the data there and collected feedback on what tribal samplers and Kodiak Indigenous community members are interested about when considering ocean acidification and its impact on marine species. And similarly to the data that Tom collected, we found that a lot of tribal members are concerned about the impacts of ocean acidification on subsistence resources, especially clams, bivalves, and shellfish. And they want to make sure that they still have access to these resources, both for food security, but also due to the impact that, or the importance of a lot of these species and the harvest of these species are to traditional knowledge, Alutiiq culture, and the spiritual wellness of communities who still do very much live off the land. And so, in thinking about these issues and trying to connect the ocean acidification to the health of Kodiak's coastal environments and communities, we discussed bringing tribal ocean acidification into context. So I want to point out as well, before kind of going into that Kodiak's community monitoring programs are part of a statewide network of community ocean acidification monitoring programs, reaching from the Arctic Ocean up to Utqiagvik, all the way down to Ketchikan and Metlakatla in extreme southeast. And this statewide network of Indigenous ocean acidification monitoring has led to a lot of innovative kind of methods on kind of ramping up mariculture and other cultural traditions to protect subsistence resources against ocean acidification and other threats of climate change. And ocean acidification monitoring can help with such projects by locating areas that are stressed, that may need further study with university or federal partners, or that might be suited to local nearshore vegetation. So I briefly mentioned kelp farming as one method that's both an economic driver and has a potential to mitigate ocean acidification in local areas. But another exciting framework for mitigating ocean acidification and ensuring cultural wellness is through clam gardens, which are a traditional Indigenous method at increasing clam harvest that's been traditionally found all the way up from near South Central Alaska all the way down to Washington State. And essentially, a community will take a rock wall like this and terrace off an area of ocean in an area where there's relatively lower flow, and they kind of create a somewhat stagnant pool. And then inside this rock wall, they'll take the crushed shells of bivalves and kind of layer it on the surface, and this is called shell hash. And as those shells slowly dissolves, it leads to regionally higher aragonite saturation levels, and it can mitigate and offset the impact of ocean acidification. And if you look at a picture of a cross-section of a clam garden here, it can really lead to increased productions of clams for community harvest and kind of the continuation of cultural programs, as well as increased local food security for harvesting communities. And some studies have shown that the input of a clam garden can increase local production of bivalves by up to 300%. So it does have a significant impact on local bivalve production. And this is just one example of how tribal ocean acidification monitoring can be directly used for local food security and cultural continuation programs. You saw a few slides ago, I had written up after kind of my work with the Kodiak Area Native Association, a report on ocean acidification monitoring, which was shared with the tribes. And we are now working on kind of some of these next step projects, including clam gardening and working with professors at the University of Alaska Fairbanks to monitor for ocean acidification near kelp farms and other mariculture projects to see how they might share or how they might help some of the tribes and local communities mitigate ocean acidification and increase their both food security and their local economies. And yeah, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being interested in ocean acidification, and let me know if you have any questions on this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the question box. I was gonna just start off with one question. So I noticed one of your pictures of the clam garden came from a Canadian source, and was just curious how much cooperation you've had with like the First Nations tribes in Canada and elsewhere around the Arctic, if you're able to get more collaboration going, since this is a very native-led project.
Yeah, so it's kind of exciting that you brought that up. So I forget it's every year, every other year, a cohort of tribes from across the Pacific, all the way from Alaska down to the Pacific Islands like Guam, Palau, and Hawaii, host the Indigenous Aquaculture Symposium, which was held this past year in Sitka. And essentially, it's people from all around the Pacific region, from different tribes and supporting programs, who come to discuss projects on Indigenous aquaculture. And that's, we did speak to some First Nations down in Canada, as well as some tribes in Washington and Southeast Alaska who are currently working on clam gardens. And we're talking with some of the tribes up in Kodiak about doing a visit or a knowledge exchange, but these are still very early talks. But I'm glad you brought that up, because yeah, the impetus for the clam garden did come from collaboration and communication across Indigenous communities. And as these projects develop, there's going to be discussion and potentially visits with a lot of the tribes as well.
That's very cool. Okay. Another question, for folks who may be interested in some of the tribe's OA data, for example, for regional synthesis, are there best practices for, one, finding out what data is out there, and two, approaching tribes to ask if we can use that data?
Yeah, so most of the data is held at the different tribes. It's not generally always publicly available. I think if you're planning on working with communities and using the data, just make sure it's with projects that have community wellness in mind, and that are built kind of with the permission and kind of the buy-in of community members kind of throughout the project. So yeah, again, there's a lot of people doing work in Kodiak, and there is data available at the NOAA Marine Fisheries Center that can be used, but tribal data and kind of tribal projects should kind of center tribal needs, and from both the planning stage of the project all kind of throughout. So I would just say start talking with tribes and discussing the project and community needs kind of before you even get diving into that stuff.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions, and we'll see if anyone has any at the end for you. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Jake and Julia. So I actually have the privilege of introducing our next speaker, and I'm just going to make sure that we have a moment to make sure the presentation gets loaded up as well. But our next speaker is Dr. Marisha Shimkoyak. She is a research social scientist with NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau. She's a 2023 CAFA PI, and she's going to be sharing with us her project. And I'm just checking to see, Alex, if you've got her presentation.
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
I needed
No,
to.
no, that's fine. But
I'm gonna change. Marisha might disappear for 1 second.
Okay.
She's still
But her project is titled Advancing Understanding of Climate Adaptation and Resilience in the Gulf of Alaska Fishing Communities. And so we'll be sharing her slides in just a moment. Good to see you, Marisha.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yep.
sorry, for some reason it's not letting me share my screen, so give me just a minute to try and figure it out.
Oh, maybe I need to do something because it says show your screen. Okay, so
Sorry.
I think I need, okay.
You see it now?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah,
Are we
thanks.
good?
Yeah, it looks good to me. So hi, everyone. My name is Marisha Shimkoviak. I'm a research social scientist with NOAA Fisheries in Juneau, and I've been working in the Gulf of Alaska region over the last couple years on sort of getting a baseline understanding of climate impacts and responses and resilience in the region. And then we initiated a project last year that Jen mentioned to initiate some adaptation planning for our fishermen. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a little sort of background as to why we created this project and proposal that was funded through CAFA. And this was based on a previous CAFA funded project called GOA Climb. If you're familiar with the climbs, GOA Climb is sort of like the sister of A Climb in Alaska, focused on the Gulf of Alaska. And it's probably not a surprise to anyone in the room that fishermen are on the front lines of climate change in the Gulf of Alaska. And there's this sort of graphic on the right just captures some of the most consistent impacts that are being witnessed in the Gulf of Alaska. And none of these things are really, happening in any kind of vacuum. They're compounding and cascading other issues in the system derived from underlying socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And the impact is not just on livelihood, it's sort of affecting the spectrum of fishermen's well-being, including their physical safety. Storms are getting worse, they're going out into worse weather conditions to make up for revenue declines. They're suffering from huge stress that goes into their families and the community more broadly. And we're seeing increased sort of social conflict around allocations. Next slide. And so in GOA Climb, we held 9 workshops throughout the region, and we were asking fishermen, what are you seeing in terms of climate change? And how are you responding? And so when we as social scientists think about adaptation, we're thinking about it as sort of happening on this spectrum from this more sort of limited and reactive change on the left-hand side to really sort of this more proactive systemic change on the right-hand side. And I would say sort of for the fisheries, the commercial fisheries system, we're sort of largely functioning somewhere between the remain and adapt components of this spectrum. Fishermen are largely sort of, they're kind of funneled into this choice set of historical choices around what they're doing in response to climate change. So they're moving around on the water to the extent that they can. They're trying to diversify their portfolios. They're trying to do some value added strategies. But we really want to sort of be moving to this right-hand side of the spectrum and sort of talk about how we are hoping to be getting there in the next couple slides. Next slide, please. So then we would end these conversations with, okay, so what do you need for resilience as fishermen and as sort of, fishing communities more broadly. And this is not intended for you to read it. It's a lot, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's intended to give you a sense of how the ideas around resilience are really multifaceted in the region. And there's a lot of them. Every workshop we would come out with 20 to 25 ideas that occur across different sort of time spectrums, right? From some initiatives that maybe the municipality could invoke, a fishing organization could sort of try to tackle, to really large scale changes in like energy systems and national policies and how a fisherman sort of interact with the scientific and fisheries management processes. Next slide, please. So we started kind of having these conversations around, okay, well, there's this sort of like spectrum of resilience ideas, but for our fishermen and fishing communities, but really right now there's no mechanism at hand to go from those ideas to any kind of implementation, right? There's some ad hoc stuff going on in our region. So I don't want to sort of say that there's nothing going on. Fishermen are, you know, and fishing organizations are definitely moving forward with some ad hoc initiatives, but there was no coherent framework for how those things were happening. So we put this proposal together with fishing and science organizations in the Gulf of Alaska for Sitka, Cordova, and Kodiak. And so for those who aren't familiar with the Gulf of Alaska, those communities sort of span from southeast to the central Gulf, and they're sort of functionally quite different in terms of what fisheries they depend upon, and sort of what the populations and what they sort of already have at hand for resilience. And then we have a number of COPIs from Sea Grant, from NAIRS, from AUs, from the AFSC community more widely. And the idea is we're going through this formal adaptation planning effort in these three communities. So really trying to go through this process of taking these resilience ideas and sort of formalizing them, right? And I'll get through that in the next couple slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a graphic just intended to sort of represent the sort of stages that we're going through, and we're hoping to have these plans created by the end of August in 2026 when this grant is done. But we kicked off the project in late 2023. We have our project teams. We've been conducting workshops in all three of our communities, and we've met as a project team multiple times to sort of share lessons learned about what, sort of what's working, what's not working. We're going through the same sort of planning stages in our communities, but every community wants to do it differently, of course. If you know Alaskans and you know fishermen, that's no surprise. Next slide, please. Okay, so this little graphic on the left-hand side sort of is, represents the stages of adaptation planning. You want to sort of assess your vulnerabilities and risks and investigate the potential options that you have to sort of mitigate those risks. So maybe even, sort of take a stock of some opportunities. And we're largely in our communities, we're in sort of different stages, but we've moved past this vulnerability assessment that I'll describe in a second. And we're moving towards visioning and sort of trying to couple our vulnerabilities and visions with adaptations. So this is going to be annoying, Alexis, because I've made it so you go through this thing. So if you can just keep clicking, yeah. So vulnerability in climate adaptation planning a lot of times focuses on like a single capital, right? So if you're a social scientist, you can sort of think of the capital assets framework, which this graphic represents, right? And a lot of times those plans down south focus on physical capital, so the intersections of climate change with physical infrastructure, right? Focusing on sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surges, and so on. We have different physical climate stressors in the Gulf of Alaska. For the most part, we're not dealing with sea level rise because we're sort of still rebounding from, there's still isostatic rebound happening in our region. We have coastal, other sort of issues with landslides and extreme precipitation events. So we have established this like huge vulnerability assessment for our communities that goes beyond this sort of traditional focus on physical capital to integrate natural capital, right? Our fishermen obviously rely on fisheries, our coastal community rely on fisheries, as Jake and Tom have spoken to. You know, it's not just commercial fishermen, there are sport fishermen, there are subsistence users, or Native Alaskans have relied on these resources for thousands of years, right? And so the assessment then focuses on physical capital, natural capital, but then we also, you know, we're having discussions about how these things have sort of secondary impacts on your access to financial capital, right? We're already sort of seeing issues with our loans as lenders become more risk averse in fisheries. And then our social capital is being frayed as we have increasing allocation conflicts. And we have different sort of human capital needs as we're losing some support services, but also see the need to sort of invest in innovative human capital workforce development strategies. And then there's political capital, right? And that's sort of shifting in response to a number of different stressors. So we developed this multifaceted vulnerability assessment to really try to get at these, not just, you know, primary, but also secondary impacts of climate change in our communities. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just intended to sort of give you an idea of how some of these things kind of play out. And there's a lot more stressors that these assessments include. But you can sort of get a sense of how climate change is impacting these other types of capital in our communities, right? These communities have a strong sense of place. A lot of them have really diverse populations, but they're concerned about their, you know, safety at sea. They're concerned about static methods and in science and management as is sort of, you know, perceived as not necessarily keeping up with the pace of climate change and affecting their capacity of fishermen to respond in turn. There's issues with the sort of, you know, lags in fisheries disaster funding, the complexity and their fishermen's of science and regulations and the capacity of fishermen to really kind of uptake that. We have decreasing support services in our communities and issues with skilled trades and so on. So this is just intended to really kind of just give you a sense of how these vulnerability assessments shake out. And you can just imagine this as like filled with stickies. Next slide, please. Okay, but we don't leave our communities hanging, right, in the red, because that's a very miserable conversation. So we have we've sort of moved past, we've done these vulnerability assessments in our communities. We've identified, you know, sort of where our fishermen and community members more widely, because I should say the workshops we're having aren't just commercial fishermen. They're all kinds of marine users. They are folks from our city and barrows. They're the harbor masters. There are folks from our economic development groups. We have a wide diversity of folks attending these workshops as they're seeing this effort sort of planning for climate change as affecting, you know, the well-being of the community more widely. Okay, so then once we move past these vulnerability assessments, we have these visioning sessions, right? And this is just an example of one that we've done in Cordova. That someone asked about the workshop. That the workshop next week is actually in Cordova is part of this effort where we're going to be sort of finalizing this vision statement, and we're going to be doing some interactive sessions around adaptation strategies. So this gives you a sense of, you know, what are some of the responses that we get from communities when we do a visioning session about what do you want your community to look like and we use 2050, right, which is almost 25 years from now. And, you know, it's a lot around that retention of the fishing identity. through stable markets, through nationalized sort of seafoods, through adaptive management practices. But it's around diversified blue economies. It's around localizing science. So there's sort of more uptake by fishermen and participation in that scientific process. It's around energy independence as well. There's a lot of interest in that in the Gulf of Alaska, moving to sort of renewable. We have a lot of renewable energy in the Gulf, but on our fishing vessels, trying to sort of move towards more efficient engine conversions to hybrid engines and sort of novel energy solutions. And there's around a lot about sort of foundation stuff and quality of life as we look towards the next generation in our fishing communities, and how do you sustain good schools and invest in our youth and education. So it's not about sort of just the fisheries piece. It's a lot about sort of thinking, in 25 years, what do you want this community to look like? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so one of the ways we're sort of framing out vulnerabilities as well is we're thinking about vulnerability sort of localized vulnerabilities and regional vulnerabilities as well. And so some of these are, highly sort of localized, and those community-based workshops do well at sort of focusing on those. But a lot of these, we're having, project team meetings and sort of wider conversations are really kind of regional vulnerabilities, right? We've seen we're seeing a huge increase in insurance costs for our fishermen. In terms of their fishing insurance, they have a hard time accessing good health insurance. These energy conversion conversations for fishermen need to be regional as well. And so one of the things we're doing as a project team as well is thinking about, okay, so how do we sort of address those more kind of regional conversations? And with the help of Sea Grant, with Jake and Dave and Holland and NARS, we're actually moving towards having a regional workshop focusing with our tribes and our fishing partners on how do you sort of address those regional vulnerabilities as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the ways that we talk in our workshops about how do we sort of move towards adaptation strategies, right, is that you kind of need to build this bridge between what our current day vulnerabilities, so thinking about that, traffic light system table of vulnerabilities, to what is the vision for the community. And so the blue arrows here capture just, some adaptation strategies that are at hand, or fishermen are already investing in, or I've talked a lot about some of the vulnerabilities that those adaptation strategies might sort of tackle, and then how does that sort of bridge to your ultimate values and vision in the community. And this is just an exercise to sort of demonstrate to communities, how some adaptation strategies might move you towards those values and visions, and so how many kind of vulnerabilities are they tackling at once. Next slide, please. Okay, one of the other conversations that we're having at these workshops as well is thinking about how when we are at the end of this adaptation planning framework and this plan, we need to have an implementation table, right? What's the strategy? What's the time frame? Who's the partner? How are they doing it? Do they need external funding? Is there a funding mechanism at hand? Is there some new innovation that they sort of need to be looking into? And what we've been developing within our communities as well is these sort of social network maps of who is in the community, what sort of resilience focal areas are they already invested in, just to make sure they are sort of at the table when we're having these workshops. So we have an updated understanding of what they're doing, how do we sort of synergize with our effort? How do we move sort of farther together by coalescing these efforts, right? Oh, okay, you're doing this. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's do that next thing that comes after that. So we use this sort of mapping to understand you know, as we're having conversations with these partners, what are they already doing, and how can we sort of build an adaptation plan that gets us sort of to that next step. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so this is also sort of one of these graphics intended to give you a sense of how in some of our communities, some of these adaptation strategies are already kind of being invoked. And so there's landslide risk assessments that are happening. There's renewable energy initiatives. There's some initiatives to diversify infrastructure to make for multi-use facilities. There's some localized science, community forums for planning. So you sort of, one of the things that we are consistently hearing is the need for community spaces to have these conversations. There's just sort of not enough of this like planning for the future happening in our communities as they experience, you know, tremendous stress in the face of climate change. Some technological innovation is happening, definitely more is needed, but this is just intended to give you sort of an example of how fishermen and our communities more widely are framing what's already kind of happening, at least to some extent, in their communities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, thanks. Okay, so in summary, I hope that gives you kind of a good sense of what the project is doing in the Gulf of Alaska. There's a lot of sort of related offshoot initiatives that this has created in the region as well that I haven't been able to speak to, but so climate change obviously is already big time happening. Our communities are highly stressed and being affected, and it's not happening in a vacuum. It's you know, exacerbating underlying vulnerabilities. In the face of adaptation planning for fishing organizations that is largely sort of ad hoc, we created this project to sort of make it more systematic, to bring our partners, you know, into these community forums to discuss climate resilience. As our fishing organizations really sort of see themselves as sort of the bedrock of our communities. So they need to be resilient for the community to be resilient as well. And this project is really participatory and collaborative. You know, I should have said that the fishing organizations in the communities are really leading this work. I am sort of providing scientific advice. I get to go to all these workshop and sort of build agendas, but they are really taking ownership of this process, which I think is critical for the buy-in within the communities more widely, and for it to you know, sort of have a resounding impact into the future. So I am done. Thank you.
Thanks, Mauricia. That was fantastic. It was great to see all of those great diagrams and information. And as you were talking, I know there's some questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask you, you talked a little bit about technology innovation. And I know in some other conversations we've talked about, you know, folks within the community helping each other out a lot, right? I think Teresa Peterson was talking about her son going fishing for the first time and people throwing gear together to help him out. And so I guess along the lines of innovation, I'm wondering if maybe there are folks that are maybe early adopters of some kinds of innovation that are bringing that to these conversations and sharing it with others to try and help along in this planning and you know, planning for resilience and trying to be more resilient.
Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of that. I think if you know fishermen, they are sort of innovators, right? I mean, they kind of have to be. They are adaptive by their nature. So I would say that like Sitka is leading in terms of engine conversion stuff, right? They're really experimenting with how do we kind of get off diesel? How do we, you know, how are we able to do like not just hybrid but fully electric engines? And processors in our region too are trying to find ways to be more energy efficient and sort of think of ways to increase renewable energy within their within their processing. And we have some innovations around like plastics and then the use of plastics in our communities, and then, you know, custom processing and sort of using underutilized species in our region, as well as we're sort of kind of maxed out on a lot of our species. So yeah, those are just, I think, some of the innovations that I can kind of speak to.
I think that's great. I mean, I know here in the Chesapeake Bay, we have conversations about blue catfish and encouraging the use of and harvesting of blue catfish instead of other species. So it's great to hear about those innovations. I know some folks had questions, and hopefully I'm able to see the questions in the chat here. I'll just ask one really quick. Brad was asking, can you tell them more about the regional vulnerability workshops when they're planned, or if you don't have a date yet, maybe if you have how you're going to share that information with folks?
Yeah, we try to put it on our website, and our community leaders in our oh, you're talking about the regional vulnerability.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, I'll finish my thought. Okay.
Yeah.
So the regional one is really just still in the works, and right now we're looking at March in Sitka. So and I you know, I'm sure that David with Sea Grant is going to help sort of advertise that, and yeah, but we're just in the planning stages, but March in Sitka sometime. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so maybe just Brad and others who are interested in this, check back with Mauricia's website and the Sea Grant website as well.
Oh yeah, if you're interested, you can email me too.
Yeah. And you can put your email in the chat for that one. I think we're going to save some time at the end for more questions, Mauricia, because I think we've got one last presenter here. So thank you so much for that. This was fantastic. And I think I'm on the hook to introduce our next presenter as well. So our next presenter is also a CAFA PI. Dr. Sarah Wise is an environmental anthropologist with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle this time, I think. And today she's going to be sharing her CAFA project that we funded in 2023. And Sarah, just wanted to check and make sure you've got everything queued up and are okay to share your presentation.
I think so. Can you all hear me? And are you seeing my presentation?
I see your screen with, it looks like a artwork. There we go. There's your presentation, and we can see your sort of note slides on the side. Just wanted to let you know that in case that's, you know, it just has your sort of sidebar thing there, but we can see your presentation.
That.
This one works.
Oh yeah, it's not gonna.
And it's okay if you're okay with that. I just wanted to let you know that everyone can see.
I don't think it will make a huge difference, but
okay.
Let me take 1 second to see.
And I forgot to mention the title of your presentation is your project, which is Advancing Climate-Informed Decision-Making Tools for Alaska Fishing Communities Through Transdisciplinary Research.
All right. Let's see. Webcam.
And it's Sarah. It totally, it looks great. I just wanted you to know that we can see that.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Let's just go forward with it then.
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you for the invitation. And this is also, as you just said, another CAFA project that was funded in 2023. And so it's well underway, and we're starting to see some of the results come through. So I really today wanted to talk about vulnerability and adaptation in rural Alaska. Mauricia, so much of what Mauricia was talking about is relevant. So it was a really beautiful setup. But I am working mostly in the Bering Sea northward region. And so while some of the issues are similar, many are also different. And of course, different communities and community needs are going on. So this project, we partnered with folks in Western Alaska and around the Yukon-Kuskokwim region in particular. And I'll show a map of that in a second. But the reason that we partnered with these communities is that they were very much on the front lines of climate change the impacts of climate change, but also in responding to, adapting to, and thinking through some of the issues around resilience. So just pulling from the news for this region, this area has been hit very hard for the last several years in terms of collapsing fisheries, wildfires, permafrost melting, lack of sea ice, Typhoon Merbok, so much more frequent and larger storms. And this is impacting communities on multiple levels. So infrastructure in terms of actually, villages falling into the water, permafrost, which is also affecting water levels and seeping in various chemicals to the water systems, as well as food storage. And then the collapse in fishery in salmon, which is the primary subsistence fishery, has hit communities very, very hard. So we're really looking at cascading impacts, climate-driven impacts into the entire. And what this means for communities as they're starting to think about resilience and really intersecting their experiences with climate and the climate impacts, thousands of years of relationship with the environment, with salmon, with the river system, with the marine system, and trying to adjust to these very rapid and in many cases unprecedented changes. So we all think about resilience and we might have some sense of what that means. And of course, there's some very clear definitions. This definition I put up here on the screen is a fairly well-supported definition: the capacity of social, economic, and environmental systems to cope with hazardous events or trends or disturbances. And the idea is that this is also to maintain essential function within the community, identity, structure, and also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, for learning, and for transformation. But when we think about resilience, we also really have to think about the context in which resilience and the idea of resilience emerges and is then acted on. And so it's socially, a lot of the literature talks about this around resilience, how not only is it context dependent in terms of what are the social relationships in place and the historical relationships and the political relationships and the governance, but also that it's socially contingent. So humans are very social beings, and as such, we rely on those relationships. So when we think about resilience, who are we thinking about it for? So resilience of what, for whom, and how it may occur and how it may be supported and sustained. This isn't necessarily a linear relationship with well-being at all. And so there's definitely room and in fact need to really think through resilience, but also maintain a real focus on well-being within communities. And the ways we frame resilience as we're thinking about adaptation, as we're working with people to support various adaptation sort of processes, it's important that we frame, the way we frame resilience does matter in those processes. So this work really looks at linkages, and linkages, of course, between vulnerability, exposure, sensitivity, but also linkages, social linkages within the communities and across. So reflecting on this Karp and al. Paper that came out in 2019, which really outlined 6 main steps of developing climate-ready management and climate-ready communities, of detecting changes, understanding mechanisms of those changes, evaluating risks and priorities, conducting assessments of those changes, then communicating advice and making management decisions. That was outlined in this paper. But with the realities of doing those steps or complicating those steps a bit, it's much more complex on the ground within rural Alaska communities. And so we modified that framework to really be relevant for Alaska Native communities and rural communities in general in Western Alaska. So detecting change really requires understanding meaning of that change. What does it mean to have permafrost melting in the region? What does it mean to have less seasonal ice flow, shorefast ice? And it's not just that there's less ice, but it also is increasing the risk at sea. So smaller boats, those who walk out onto the ice perhaps to fish for or crab in the winter, are less secure. Rougher seas require larger boats, require different organizational structures within the crew. And so all understanding the meaning of those changes is key. And then understanding the mechanisms across those changes. And this is where we have really worked very closely with partners, Indigenous partners in the region, to think about deep knowledge. And that's bringing to bear and thinking through Indigenous knowledge. Some of these villages have been operating, living, and experiencing change in the region for thousands of years. And so the knowledge there is highly relevant, and also a very, very, coming from very, very different perspectives. So the idea of multiple knowledge systems and bringing together multiple knowledge systems is a complex one, and one we're continuing to figure out. So documenting observations, changes and patterns, which we've been doing in the region, and we're drawing from multiple knowledge systems to do that, and multiple methodologies. And then, of course, exploring the range of adaptive responses across scale. So from the very, very small community level, community driven, perhaps, but also very effective in terms of being a targeted response to much larger across scale responses. And then ways to inform management and ways to communicate that information in the most effectively for decision making. So really thinking about this region here, that's a picture of much of Alaska, not all of it, but I wanted to be able to see that Yukon drainage area that's in the gray box down. You can see it's highly fluid in terms of the Yukon drains into that area. It's extremely wet and a wetland, highly productive space. It's also seeing dramatic declines in salmon and across species, and Chinook, coho, and chum salmon are really key species for the area for food security, for subsistence. There's also historically been a commercial fishery there, but also for identity, social networks, and relationships, for household structures, for learning. And so we're seeing all of that change very, very radically with the decrease in the number of salmon. Again, just another map that you can see in the region that we're working on. The Yukon is over 1,900 miles long. It's a transboundary. It crosses into Canada. There's also 11,000 people that live along the Yukon, and that represent more than 58 tribes in the region, and over 90 villages in Alaska alone that rely on salmon as a major food and cultural source. Nearly 90% of the population along the Yukon in Alaska is Alaska Native. And so we're dealing with very complex governance systems, very complex cultural systems, in some cases, language systems. And so the complexity just in this one region is very, is daunting at times. But this is a subsistence wheel that shows we are focusing on salmon with this project, but this is really showing the suite of subsistence resources that people along the Yukon rely on. And this is anywhere from, this is also across the calendar month. So it's anywhere from bear to berry picking, caribou, waterfowl, etc. And then you can see that that middle range of blue is the salmon. So salmon is only one of many, but it is a very important and substantial one that runs across multiple months. So just looking at Chinook, one species of salmon, it's been threatened for quite a few years now, and you can see here the declines in escapement goals. So this is where we have agreements with Canada that because Canadian communities also rely on salmon for many of the same reasons, we have agreed to make sure that a certain number of fish cross over into Canadian waters called escapement. And so you can see just by counting the number of fish, and that escapement goal is there in the solid black line, and the hatched line are those that are more desirable, and the bare minimum, the threshold, is that solid black. But we have been well under that threshold for several years. Some of the changes that we're seeing and that have been documented through both traditional knowledge as well as Western science methodologies that we're working with in this transdisciplinary team are, as I mentioned, increased storms and much wetter conditions, which is affecting well, I'll get to the actual social effects in a minute, but changes in wind direction and wind strength, which is affecting also run conditions, salmon population run conditions. Less snow, but much warmer temperatures, which is increasing the rain. And so we're having much more flooding, more erosion, visibly less salmon in all phases of life, including from salmon fry to returning fish. Increases in diseases such as ichthyophonus, which is causing ghost fish or dead fish floating in the river. The salmon in general has been observed to get smaller in the number, but also in body size and body condition has been less healthy. And fewer other fish as well are being seen. So late winter ice and early spring breakup is causing changing conditions in the area, as well as transportation during the winter, how you get to various neighboring communities is through snow machine and over the ice, and this isn't as possible. But the window of possibility is much shorter in years than it has been in the past, as well as much more dangerous. And some of the disruptions that people are talking about are disrupted sharing networks. There's what have been historically called super providers, or there's a number of names for them, but basically within communities, a couple people tend to harvest the most and then share within the community with elders, with family and neighbors. And so the reliance of harvest tends to be on a select group, and those sharing networks are becoming disrupted. There's less fish shared. More is, not enough is being gotten to share beyond just immediate family members. And so this is affecting relationships and affecting networks. Disrupted knowledge sharing in this last 7 years that Chinook salmon, there's been disrupted or no subsistence fishing for Chinook. Fish camps have closed, and we keep hearing there are children who've never been to fish camp, who have grown up without knowing what that's like, without fishing with their grandparents. And that's a loss that is being felt very deeply. Reduced confidence in management. So less collaboration and less desires to collaborate, which is affecting management compliance and effectiveness, but also affecting conducting research in the area if it has anything to do with management targets. Shifts in target species, far more people are hunting for moose than they have been in the past. There's also larger mammals being seen closer to communities and within communities. So for instance, bear are coming into the community, so there feels like there's greater risk around that as well. Increased food insecurity. People are very concerned about not having enough food to winter through. And increased mental health concerns across age ranges, but particularly for teenagers who are experiencing a loss of identity, connection, and really meaning as quote unquote salmon people. What are we now is one of the quotes that we keep hearing. So that's very dark realities of what people are reporting and going through, but we're also seeing tremendous ground swelling of collaboration, coordination, and responses to some of these impacts. And this is across institutions, but it's also on the individual household level, but we're seeing it across community social institutions and beyond. So there are ground up mental health initiatives, getting back to the land. So efforts of people actually taking children from schools or from various groups into on trips to get back to the land and learn how to do subsistence. And it's an organized cross-community endeavor. Also, community agricultural and marketing programs are popping up in various communities. So small growing initiatives to really experiment with what can grow in the region with these new conditions and what grows well, and then transferring some of that into more community events. So these very miniature and spontaneous farmers markets kind of growing up in the summer. So what was once people going to fish camp together, now people are growing in these community greenhouses and then selling them at these small markets. What was once a really rich boat building and boat in one particular community, they converted the boat barn from boat building to boat repair, as well as lumber transport and export. All of these efforts are fairly small in scale, but they're connected to much larger initiatives as well. And then also bringing in some of the social community organizations, bringing in and organizing around various initiatives, whether it's educational efforts or resale efforts through the CDQ program. And so that the idea, the consistency that we're seeing is this sort of keeping community, supporting community, and trying to build new ideas of how to be community. So as part of that, the project is looking at institutional mapping and within the Bering Sea region and how institutions are connected, not just through organization. For instance, let's say if the University of Alaska has as an outreach center, but also through information flows and financial flows. So for instance, University of Alaska has an outreach school in Nome, and what sorts of spin-offs are happening with that, including subsistence harvest training and reindeer herding classes and that sort of thing. And so we're trying to map these initiatives. This is just a snapshot because this is dynamic and it very much changes. So we're not so much looking at the actual hard what exists in that moment, but also the connectivity of what exists and the relationality of what exists. So this just image that's unlabeled on the left there, that is the Bering Sea coastal community region. But if you're looking a little bit closer on first degree, second degree, and third degree connections, you can start to see some of that connectivity. So if we just take the one community of Nome and we look at the various institutions that are operating within Nome, and then we look at what they are connected to through information, through financial pathways, through active trade, we can start to see the complexity that exists across the region. So these are the partners that we have been working together with. Serena Fitka is the executive director of the Yukon River Drainage Fisheries Association, and she's been in that role for many years now, really trying to unify Yukon communities toward healthier and more sustainable ways of adapting to some of the climate impacts that are happening. And then the other two, Catherine Moncrief and Rachel Kangas, are her staff members. Ellen Yasumishi has been working she's with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and she's been doing a lot of the modeling of salmon to understand mortality rates and mortality sort of pinch spots within their life cycle. And thank you. I'll just leave it at that one.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that presentation and was really fascinated by some of the conversations around the shifting of, species, from fish to maybe moose or caribou or other things like that. I do know we had a couple of questions in the chat, and I know we're at time too, so I guess I'm just going to check with Alex really quick. Is it okay to go do one question?
Yes, I think people may have to head out, but we can take a few minutes to do some more questions if there's some we'd like to address before we end.
Okay. Sarah, someone asked about elaborating a little further on what ghost fish means or what they are.
Yeah, but ghost fish is just sort of a common term for dead fish floating in the river that turned white, but also because of the ichthyophobus, that is a disease that affects, that is more increasingly affecting salmon. So we're seeing a lot more dead fish in the river, and they're called ghost fish.
Thank you for that. And I know Mauricia had to hop off for another call. I don't know if the other presenters and organizers want to hop on camera really quick to say thank you if they're still on the call. I know we had a couple of questions in here, and so maybe what we can do is take the follow-up to get back to folks if we don't have time for questions. But Alex, I leave that up to you as to your thoughts on this. Sorry, we ran a little over today.
Sorry, see, I'm muted. I think it's up to you, Jen, if you want to take one or two more and then hop off unless people have to go. Sorry, we're a little bit over time.
Sure, and I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters. Thank you very much. These were fantastic presentations, and we really enjoyed hearing about your work and the great work you're doing in the communities. I guess I know there was one question, and it's hard for me to tell, and I'm a little clunky with the question box, so I apologize, but someone had asked, and I think this might have been for Mauricia, and I think she's hopped off the call, but there was a question about management on-ramps being explored for workshop outputs and visioning exercises, and better understanding of what policy decisions they would be able to influence and how. And I don't know if that's something, maybe Tom, I don't know if this relates to your project as well, but I think it was for Mauricia earlier, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, Mauricia probably would need to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's for her.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem. I think those were all the questions. Alex, do you see any others in there that I've missed? Sorry, it's hard
I think that covers the majority of them. Sarah, we do see your screen still, just so you know if you want to go ahead and stop your screen sharing. But yeah, I think we've covered the majority of questions, and the PIs have provided their emails, and so we definitely encourage you to reach out to them if you have more questions or would like to engage in further dialogue with them if they're willing. So with that, I think we will say thank you so much to our presenters for a really great conversation. Even though you're all working on different projects, it's really nice to see the overlap and connection between them across the related themes and topics. So thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you have a great weekend.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.